So let's try and put some numbers onto what we've been talking about. Let me first give you a couple of caveats. First of all, this is joint work with Francis Denig and Dr. Mobello. Francis is a clever guy, so he's used some advanced software for creating the slides, which means that I couldn't compile the slides. So I had to splice them together, so it's going to look a little bit like jump around a bit. Sorry about that. Second caveat, like a lot of the criticism that we've heard yesterday and today of these ideas and this idea of Pareto improving climate policy, I think, I accept that some of these things are valid criticisms. We should base this stuff on empirics. I'm not completely sure whether I would sort of make strong policy recommendations based on this, but this is like how we regard this work is. It's kind of a first exploration in a bit more detail into this idea. Okay, so I'm going to skip most of the maths, but, and I'm going to try and be quite clear about. I'm very happy for you guys to stop me when I'm in the middle of this first 15 minutes if I'm being unclear. Yeah? Okay, so usually we kind of know what we're talking about, but let me just make it clear. So usually when we try and evaluate climate policy, we come up with a social welfare function. It might look something like this. Social welfare is the sum of discounted utilities, where utilities come from a stream of consumption over time. So C1 is consumption in period 1. That's the utility from that. C2 is in period 2. You get some utility from that. You discount it by the factor delta, which we take typically as being between 0 and 1 somewhere. Maybe it's delta squared from the third period and so on. This would be exponential discounting, but actually this delta might be just the discount factor might vary in some other general way over time. And then we try and maximize this function. So we try and maximize this sum of discounted utilities. This is a fairly basic framework, simple framework, but it captures the essentials of the problem. And here the intergenerational distribution of welfare is essentially compressed into this delta, into this discount factor term. Okay, so that's definitely an ethical parameter. And there's been this big debate about how should we choose the parameter. So if we discount at a high rate, so delta is quite low, then the optimal policy will involve fairly modest abatement early on, high discounting. Yeah, modest abatement. There's going to be lowest consumption during earlier periods. There's going to be higher consumption later on, relative to the business as usual. If we take zero discounting, that would be like the Nordhaus approach. If we take zero discounting, which would be like the Stern approach, then mitigation is going to be higher, early consumption is going to be even lower, later consumption is going to be even higher. So that's how the choice of the discount rate delta factors into this thing. So this is the picture that we've seen before, with a slightly different version of it. So let's take these things to be the utilities. So these are the utilities that agents today and agents in the future can have. And this is the Pareto frontier. It's the best the best possibilities that we can do. This is the locus of efficient points. Okay? So it's always better to be out that way, but the frontier gives exactly how far we can go. And basically the discount rate says something about the slope that we're imposing here. So if we have a a high discount rate like Nordhaus, then the slope is going to be quite steep, and the best possible point is at the tangency condition where this thing just touches the frontier, like here, and we can see that in this example, the way I've drawn it, the people today have quite high utility, the people tomorrow have quite low utility compared to the business as usual. So this would actually be a case where, unlike what John's graph, for example, was showing us, where even the kind of Nordhaus case takes us somewhere a little bit to the left of B. We're actually now to the right and below B. And of course this fat line of the frontier here is the set of efficient points, which are also Pareto. So Pareto dominates the business as usual. Okay. And
Sorry. Who have you got on the axis?
So on this graph, I'm just thinking about sort of people in the present, and this is people in the future.
Down here in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And if you had somebody now like Stern who has a much lower discount rate, then this slope would be much shallower, and the tangent point would be somewhere over there, possibly to the left of C. So that would be efficiency with sacrifice. This is also with sacrifice, but it's sacrificed by the future, essentially. Okay, so what we want to do in this paper is we want to take a slightly different stance on how we make this ethical decision. Instead of picking a slope and finding the point, we say, let's take the business as usual as normatively relevant, and let's try and find a point which dominates business as usual, and then actually we can also ask the question, well, what's the slope at whatever point we find? So we try and come up with a fairly intuitive way of picking a particular point somewhere on this frontier, and then we can also back out the discount rate. So how do we do this? We've all kind of seen this. This is time. We divide time into periods. Let's suppose there's some policy. This is some sort of small climate mitigation policy, for example, which involves losses in the early periods, but quite large gains in the future periods. And we take a set of overlapping generations. So in the first period, you have generation 0 and 1. 0 is old, these guys are young. Then in the next period, the old have died, the young have become the old, and there's a new generation and so on. Okay? And let's just suppose that these costs and benefits are evenly divided between the current young and the old, always, at each period. So these costs and benefits affect, for example, the wage income of the young and the capital income of the old. So if we divide everything evenly, that's the sort of distribution of gains and losses from this little project, and also over every generation's lifetimes. We can see that these guys definitely lose out. These guys, depending on how much they discount their future gains, they might lose a benefit, and these guys are going to gain from the project. And what we do is we can come up with a set of transfers. So we can say, let's put this green transfer, which is being paid from the young in the first period to the old. So the magnitude of the transfer has been designed so that the first old are exactly indifferent, because you sum these two up, you get 0. But these guys are actually now suffering an even higher loss. But that's okay, because there can be a following pension in the next period, which is then made designed so that these guys, they might be made indifferent. They might be, they're not going to be losing out anymore with this pension. Those guys lose, and so on. We can construct this stream of transfers so that actually nobody loses out. And what happens is these guys who benefit a long time in the future, they actually compensate earlier generations, who in turn compensate even earlier generations for having taken on this project, possibly like more than a century ago. Okay. This is the basic idea, and you could do this with these things. Could be called pension payments. They could be government debt. So these guys might benefit because the government takes on some debt, gives it to the old consume a bit, and then these guys are here paying the interest on the debt according to some schedule. So that's how you could implement this, for example. There might be other ways. So what we do in this paper, we characterize the Pareto frontier. We basically get a reasonably straightforward efficiency condition. It's kind of, in hindsight, it's obvious. Marginal cost of the marginal cost of reducing carbon equals the sum of the marginal benefits over time. We introduce a notion of an intergenerational bargain to essentially pick a particular point on the Pareto dominating section of the frontier. I'll be much more specific about that. And then we calibrate to the DICE model, which is the sort of, I would really say, canonical climate economy model. So we wanted to be very standard about what we do so that people would find it very easy to understand how the model works. We contrast our proposal to both the kind of, to caricature the Stern and the Nordhaus cases. We show that neither one of those cases Pareto dominates the business as usual, whereas the bargain that we construct by design, by construction, dominates it. Okay. And we get a carbon price which is somewhere between Stern and Nordhaus. Okay, so that's been previous literature. I'm going to skip that. I told Armin that I'd sort of say some nasty things about him skipping this talk, but that's fine. Maybe I don't have the time to do that. I'm going to skip the model. It's a pretty standard DICE model. It's got the only differences are we have a simplified carbon cycle, we have a simplified climate submodule, and we explicitly consider extraction of sort of energy, fossil energy or whatever it is. But otherwise it's sort of very standard. I'm very happy to take questions and we can talk about that later on. Okay. Do I have... okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about these compensation mechanisms, but let me just say that what happens here is so climate change hits both capital and wage income. These are the two types of income in the economy. All of production is divided into capital and wage income. There's something spent on energy extraction. Climate change hits both of these, and emission abatement hits both of these. And when you start implementing these pensions, this policy makes people realize that actually, when I'm old, I optimize in some way. Now, when I'm old, I'm actually going to get this pension in the future, so I'm going to save less. And that's essentially the channel by which investment in physical capital is reduced. So in effect, what happens here is exactly this shift in the saving portfolio from physical to natural capital. And there's a whole lot of sort of effects happening in equilibrium. We account for all of those, and basically what we get is we get this very straightforward formula of marginal cost is equal to the sum of discounted marginal benefits. Very standard. So here's the Pareto frontier again. Let me now quickly tell the algorithm that we use to pick a particular point. We first take only two generations, the first two generations, the current old and the current young. And they agree on some level of abatement today, and they agree on a pension today. And from tomorrow onwards, there's going to be no policy. And what happens then, the way they choose this quantity of abatement of emissions and the pension is designed so that they keep the current old. So now this is going to be the current old, the first generation. This is going to be the second generation, the current young. They keep the current old exactly indifferent to business as usual. So these two generations get together and they move to point C. Okay, that's the point that they pick. And now we introduce a third generation. That gives us more abatement opportunities because this externality reaches to the next period as well. So what we had there just before was this part of the graph. That's the Pareto frontier between the first two generations. We've moved to point C. Now we introduce the third generation. This whole Pareto frontier becomes three-dimensional because there's a further generation here, and it sort of expands out a bit from this thing as well. And then we basically keep the first two generations utilities just at where they were in the previous step, and then we give all of the extra surplus to the third generation. And then we keep on adding these generations. And basically, we abate in every period up to the number of generations that have been included. And of course, the more generations we include, the more abatement there will be in every period. Okay, so I might go over by like 2 minutes, but let me just quickly say what we do here. So for the numerical calibration, we calibrate this to the DICE model in a fairly standard manner. So the DICE model is this thing here. And then we say, let's impose a social welfare function where the social planner uses Pareto weights, so puts a declining weight on generations as time goes on. It declines in an exponential manner, so it's a little bit like discounting. It's a bit like generational discounting. And we calibrate the time preference rate for this so that we roughly match the carbon taxes that Nordhaus gets in his infinitely lived agent model, where you don't explicitly model the generations. And then we say, well, what if we put this discount rate to zero? Then we get something that looks like the Stern carbon taxes. So carbon taxes are much higher, abatement is much more intense. And then we say, well, given this model, what does our bargain look like? And we've solved for this bargain where all of the surplus always goes to the new included generation. We get carbon taxes somewhere in between there. So they actually start quite high at something like $200 per ton of carbon, but they're much lower than the Stern formulation would give, for sure.
Sorry, hang on, is that $1,000 per ton of carbon?
Yeah, this would be the Stern thing in our model. So So don't take this too seriously, right? Don't pay attention to the numbers.
Okay.
Because, first it's an integrated assessment model and there are problems with those anyway, but pay attention to the fact that we're somewhere in between.
Okay.
So, we can calibrate this in a different way, we can get different numbers. I'm pretty sure that this would sort of roughly hold anyway. And we've done some other runs as well. The pension transfers, and here's actually why. Because Stern and Nordhaus in what they do, they have an infinite loop dating model, and they just say the only instrument that you have is you mitigate whatever you do. We have here now these transfer instruments, and actually in the Stern and the Nordhaus runs, as we call them, the Stern run has these rather sizable pensions going up to 10% of GDP flowing back in time, because the social planner is very impatient. He prefers early generations to consume more, so not only do they abate less, but also they actually put on very sizable pension transfers, which always benefit the old generation. Whereas in the Stern case, Stern is very patient, so it goes the other way. The old always pay a lot more to the young, so that the young can transfer even more consumption into the future. And these compensating pensions that we get, they're actually quite sort of small in reality. So that's partly why we get these high carbon prices, because we also allow these transfer instruments between generations. Okay, I'm running out of time. Two more slides or something. So the green is our bargain, and this is sort of saying something about welfare, how welfare improves. So you can see that the green line is always above zero. It's Pareto improving. Everybody benefits. It's quite small by design here, because we first take the first two generations who get together, mitigate a little bit, but they can't do very much between themselves, and then we fix their welfares. So all the extra surplus goes into the future. This would be the Nordhaus case. Early generations benefit, future generations lose out quite a lot with all these transfers in place, and with Stern it goes the other way. So it's really costly for the first old, because there's a lot of mitigation, plus they have to give money to the young. So then we say, well, Stern and Nordhaus, they're not really talking about these transfers. So what if we just solve the model, given what we have, and then we just say that actually, about these pensions that are included, let's just zero them out. Or let's keep the carbon taxes at the same level. So that's like a naive implementation of the actual optimal policy. And then the Nordhaus thing is much more moderate. The first old lose a little bit, about sort of 0.1% of GDP for 25 years. But that's still substantial. That's like a recession. And then there's benefits later on in the future, but not quite as much as in the bargain. In the Stern case, when we do this naive policy without shutting out these transfers towards the future, there's still sizable losses, very sizable losses early on, and then great benefits later on. Okay, 2 more slides. When we do this policy, there's a carbon rent out there. This might be carbon tax revenues or cap and trade auction revenues. The carbon rent is allocated according to sort of wage and capital income shares. This is what the young get as a share of their income in carbon taxes, and this is how much they have to pay as a share of their income to the old. So actually the young get a lot, and they have to pay a little tiny compensating pension. So certainly the early generations probably wouldn't find these pensions to be somehow unfair. This reverses sometime in the 22nd century, but we can still see that actually, the pensions that have to be paid as compensation for past mitigation, they're still quite small, like less than 1% of the income, a bit more than 0.5% of income, the net of the little carbon tax that you still get in the future. So, it's not it doesn't seem like something that would cause the young to kind of rebel and say, actually all this mitigation that was done, it's nice that it was done, but we're not going to be paying for this anymore. I think, this is probably justifiable and politically maintainable. And then the final thing that we can do is we can sort of look at this point that we find on this multidimensional Pareto frontier, and we can say, well, at that point, what does the slope look like? That gives us the discount rate structure, and we see that the implicit utility discount rate is somewhere between 1% and 1.2%. It's got this funny inverted U-shape, which I'm not sure how to interpret that. It may be of interest to people who are used to thinking about the problem starting from the discount rate.